All right, everybody, we are back on the Coach's Compass episode. I don't even know. Like we said, we've been just rolling, having a lot of fun with this, bringing on guests from all different avenues. We started the Coach's Compass and thought that we were just going to go down strength and conditioning, but no, we're going down every single avenue that comes into play with coaches and working with athletes. So, as always, we got a special guest with us, but remember, hit that like button, subscribe, comment, so we can go ahead and continue to spread this thing all around. It's your boy, Coach Coop, and your boy, Jay, reporting live over here from Europe. But we got a special guest with us because it is an important month. And not only just for this month, but all around every month, this should be talking about mental health. Right, we've got Dorthe Hummel coming on with us today. She's a mental health coach from Denmark, works with many college and NFL, not only Danish athletes, but athletes from every different country. But like I said, she's worked with Danish athletes that I've also worked with, including Thomas Ashworth, Andreas Påske, Mads Højen. She's also worked with Yelmer. She's working with a guy that's now currently playing for the Arizona Cardinals, Hjalte Froholt. And now also, on top of that, coaching coaches on the mental aspects of things. Right, so Dorthe, thank you for being here with us today and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I look so much forward to both what you have in mind for asking me and sharing all my work with this. So thank you for having me.
For sure. I mean, like, like mental health, and like we talked about before we even jumped on, is like, it's somewhat still a taboo, still somewhat kind of like a niche. And especially you're talking to a guy like myself, 32 years of age, and come from old school coaches to where we didn't talk about mental health, right? Like, you got to be mentally strong. You show up, like, you play, like, whatever you got going on outside, like, forget about it. Like, that doesn't matter. But nowadays, you're seeing a lot of athletes that are taking their lives due to mental issues, and also guys that are feeling lost, you know, when the sport is over or when they get injured or anything like that, because our identity is so much wrapped up in our sport. What are you doing to help the athletes on the mental side of things?
Well, that's a really big question, first of all, because besides the mental health, because I look at everything from a proactive approach. So I consider the brain as part of the body, obviously, because it is. So we have a tendency of isolating things in sport, especially in sport, I would say, where we have a department for the physio part, which would be strength and conditioning. It could be a nutritionist, it could be a physiotherapist or whatever. So we separate things and then just think that we can locate things isolated. But to look at the mental part of it, obviously the brain is kind of the headquarter for this. So I always try to look at things in a proactive approach. So rather than waiting for people to collapse mentally, because they are on a lot of pressure in so many ways, expectations from themselves, expectations from the external, expectations from the clubs, or even if they're not professional yet, expectations in general. We have social media and stuff. There's also a huge part of the mental health that actually comes from the physical health. I would actually almost say 90% of what might trigger the mental side of it is actually our lifestyle on a physical level. So let me give you an example then. A lot of people that deal with anxiety and depression, it's usually due to a low production of serotonin. So serotonin is also the antidepressant medicine that we would get if we were dealing with those things. And a lot of people are on those medical pharmaceuticals today. The thing is about serotonin specifically, that's a neurochemical that is being released in the gut. So that actually travels from the gut to the brain. And as soon as we have those neurochemicals in balance, we are obviously in a better mental state. But the question is, what comes first then? So if people have a really bad diet, for instance, first of all, they have a lot of food intolerances, they have a lot of high cortisol due to a lot of stress. All these things might actually have a really bad impact on the gut microbiome, which then disable the gut to produce that very, very important serotonin. So that's part of what I would look at in terms of what comes first in this matter. And I actually had a professional, I cannot say his name or anything, but I had a professional athlete last year that completely collapsed during the season with anxiety and depression. And what we actually discovered in measuring all these things, because I normally always do a lot of lab testing for the gut microbiome, the genetics, the hormones and stuff. So even looking at where do we have an imbalance in this case on a mental side, but what does it come from? I'm always looking at the root cause. I'm not saying it's that all the time, but 90% just by that neurochemicals is relying on being produced in the gut. So it's a really big likelihood of something is out of place in the gut to begin with, which it was in this case. So just by rebalancing like the foundation of it, all of a sudden he was able to function in a better level. He was better at lowering his cortisol. And besides that, of course, I would always look at, so what outside external things would be triggering that emotional thing that might stress you out, or whatever internal thing, because we have external and internal both stresses but also motivation factors. So I would look at on the individual side, find out what would necessarily be the one thing that would be triggering you the most. Another thing I would be looking at in this specific case would also be screen time, because that's just such a basic information, because we know that and we shouldn't do that and all these things, but we actually don't really consider how important it is. It's really serious to limit the melatonin production, because the melatonin that we're supposed to release during a good night's sleep is helping us to recover better, but certainly also to rebalance the brain that has been processing so many information, dealing with a lot of emotions, a lot of stress, frustration, and all these things. But if that has not happened during a good night's sleep, and we then also disable our body to release the human growth hormone, there's all of a sudden a whole avalanche of things that will be occurring. And then actually, it accumulates over time, and eventually that might come out like you said, we have heard some really, really bad incidents in terms of people actually taking their own life. It's just, for me, it's insane it even got that far. Why was anybody not addressing this problem when there was a slight imbalance in that?
What would you say what would you say, like, if you had to rank, or like if you had to address something immediately, like, is it the serotonin deficiency, the melatonin deficiency, the environment? Like, how would you rank those, and just like, this needs to be addressed first, or just like, and with regards to like other?
Do you mean in terms of getting the actual data on the testing, or
more just like
just in general?
Affecting having a positive effect on an athlete based off, let's say he has a serotonin deficiency and melatonin deficient, and probably doesn't have the best environment. Like, what do you think? What would you rank those, if, like, I guess?
Well, ideally, I would obviously prefer to have the exact data, because that's also how I look at mental training. Mental training is not for me just some kind of methodology. It's exact data. And what I mean by data is testing them neurochemically on a genetic level. So we are actually born with a certain, what you call it, like, our resilience is predisposed. So just establishing that information, that also gives me an idea about this person might actually struggle already genetically, or maybe being triggered with a low serotonin, for instance, just to stay with that example. So what kind of interactions would I do to enhance that? It could also be a very high dopamine, but an overproduction of dopamine might also fatigue the brain quite a lot. It's kind of like a drug constantly. And that doesn't leave any room to get that serotonin up. So if I would do the testing, not everybody has access or the finances to do that. But ideally, like I said, I would always address it with a test. Let me see your actual numbers. And from then I would create a program, which would be daily interactions, or it could be what kind of food, what kind of supplements would you need? Because again, everything is connected. So we need to understand the importance of, maybe there's more areas. But actually, I had a meeting with a client yesterday, and I always get asked this question: what's the number one performance tool for mental health, for instance, or mental before I do anything? It's always like, I'm keep it to the basic. Let's look at your sleep. So no matter what testing I would have done, what kind of result, I would always make sure that so important recovery tool, obviously, we need to address that if anything else is not working. If that thing works well, is the quality good enough, for instance? And then again, questionnaire, having the dialogue with the individual, find out what would be triggering you the most. Is it on the field, if it's a player, or in the cage, or whatever we're talking about for an athlete? Where is it exactly that you feel triggered the most? Usually it's actually in between games or fights or whatever people have. It's very rare that it's necessarily only during an actual performance. but there's so many things going on in between that, and you guys will probably remember that as well. There's so much stuff in terms of social media, addiction in general, to whatever, to just our phone, to news, to scrolling and stuff like that. And it's not just to pick on that phone, but it has really become a big problem for everyone.
What are
Wow.
like when guys start talking about like having mental health issues, and you talk to, you know, their peers and stuff, what are like some signs that people can pick up on to like know that like this person probably needs help? Like people are getting to the point where they're taking their lives. Like, how do we as others know like what, like, hey, this is like a clear sign that like, hey, maybe you should talk to somebody?
Mm. Oh, that's such a good question, because there's a lot of physical signs usually. And that's also why I always have a lot of questions with my athletes. And it could even be, how often do you go to the toilet? Again, we're back to everything is just a sign. So if you have, if you're bloated every time you eat, if you have a headache, if you feel fatigue, where you actually shouldn't feel fatigue, if you wake up still tired, there's all these little signs that actually means much more than people would think. But that means that we're just gotten used to a low baseline. So we're just used to performing from this baseline. Yeah, but I always had bad skin, or I always had hurting in my joints, for instance. But that's a symptom. That's not a something you should accept. It's not a common place to be. So there's always something to look into in those specific things. But specific health, it would be something related to motivation, focus, memory, bad sleep, neck pain, stuff like that, where you kind of lose your focus, would normally be the signs that I would look into. But I do believe that a big responsibility in this, and that's why I love your mission in this, is I believe it comes from the coaches, because I haven't actually worked that much with team sports until recently, until the last 4 or 5 years. But what I have obviously realized, because it's a male dominated world, obviously the players are males, usually the decision makers are males and stuff. There's a lot of culture that is just being continued, because we don't actually have that much diversity, even though a lot of people talk about it, but we don't. So if you actually don't have anybody, breaking the patterns of the old culture, we would still continue to do the same thing. And I do believe, and I also feel like from the players that I work with in various sports teams, that it's still not something you talk about. And what I actually hear a lot is that when I have a meeting with, let's say, the younger the players, the more focused they are usually on the physical part. I need to learn this skill. I need to be better physically and stuff, which is obviously logic. But that's also why that part of that mental part, that mental performance, that's not important. I'm super mentally strong. And I can give you an example like Hjalte, for instance. Would you think that someone like Hjalte, he's mentally strong? You'd probably say, yeah, otherwise he wouldn't have gotten to the NFL. So, and when I started working with him, he was already in the NFL. So he was not a question of whether he was mentally strong. He just knew this is a power tool that I can use to make everything else in place much better. So I do believe, back to your question, I do believe that a lot of the responsibility lies actually on the coaches, which is why I'm so glad that I'm finally get to spread that message with the coaches, because I believe that if the coaches kind of allow the athletes to be in a space, because we're just human beings. So we're not a robot that you can just train so hard. And you guys especially know that as a strength and conditioning coaches, we have good days, we have bad days. But what does it come from? Does it come from an emotion due to a situation? Or is it the other way around? Am I just so physically fatigued that my brain just cannot operate anymore? And by that, I feel like I'm more emotional today. So there's a lot of things that we need to accept, because again, going back to, we are really just human beings. And yeah. Does
How do
that
you
answer
feel
your question?
the environment of like American football being like, you need to be tough, there needs to be like a mental fortitude, and nothing should be able to bother you, and then trying to implement that within the coaches, where it's just like that culture there, the foundation of that culture is already there, where it's just like, you need to be like a man, and
Yeah. I experience obviously that a lot in American football, because there's a very huge old culture about the militaristic approach in that specific sport. I can kind of understand it when you look how tough that sport is. I mean, can I sit and cry before I get into the field and get run over by a truck? I guess not. So I can kind of understand it. I mean, even I wouldn't do it, and I don't consider myself as specifically sensitive in that sense. So I can understand that you have to toughen up and stuff like that. And yeah, it's again, no, it's just losing track. But anyway, I think that in that specific sport as well, there's more. My different approach of the mental part is like, I always look at the brain as the headquarter. That's the main operator. I mean, imagine this. Imagine that you saw an athlete that was running on the field with no head on. And then all of a sudden, he was waiting for the head to catch up. The main operator is like the hardware, it's the software, it's everything that makes everything take the actual action, make the performance. So if you don't look at the brain, first of all, as an brain spending energy source, because we actually spend more than 25% just by operating in the brain. So that's a calorie, 25% of our calorie intake we just spend by operating. But if we don't get the right fuel, for instance, for the body being delivered to the brain, all these mental cognitive disabilities or imbalances show up. So I think, again, like we need to look at that we have a proactive or preventive approach to the mental rather than always waiting for things to occur, because that's what I don't remember how many years ago it was in the NFL that they have a requirement they needed, or it was it was required for the clubs to have at least one sports psychologist. I don't know if you guys remember when that was, but they're always like placed in the end of the department, and if you show up more than once or twice, it's like, are you sure you're strong enough to be here? And that's for me the complete opposite approach. I think we need to look at, first of all, if we can stay with American football, it's completely like chess on grass. There's so much cognitive. That's also why I'm super fascinated about it. One thing, it is super hard physically, and it's so mentally exhausting because you have to make decisions like this. Then you have a huge book you need to, which is the weird language I never understood. Anybody can remember that? It's like, what are you talking about in that playbook? But all that you have to memorize those. You have to hear those things in a split second in a game. There's so much on a cognitive energy expenditure that's been going on as well. And that's just the brain. We're not even talking about the psychology and the mental approach on this. So I would always look at how can you prepare yourself for that huge hard performance you're getting into? How can you use your brain and your mental capacity as your biggest and strongest tool to make sure whatever you have prepared in your physical training will be at its best? That's how you should look at the brain going forward. So obviously part of that would also be understanding my emotions on the given day. Everybody I have a client that is probably some of the toughest players. I even have UFC fighters that, like, who gets into that cage to get kicked out? But they do. Just like you guys. You go in there and you just accept that you're going to be run over by a truck. So there's a lot of things that are going on a subconscious mind that might be doubting ourselves, or, oh shit, they look a little bit stronger than me today. Am I able to actually stand up for what I think I can do and stuff like that? So again, creating that foundation on the individual, regardless of how that neurochemical genetic testing would look, because that's just a tool to know exactly how to navigate and bring the best out of the individual.
But like with that too, and like also, what about the guys that, you know, suffer from, you know, maybe ADHD, ADD, or might be like high on the spectrum and like still high functioning and stuff? Like, how does that come into play with like the mental health, and like also working with like everything correlating? Also, everything starts in the brain, but that's like something that, you know, they might be high anxiety and everything. Like some guys get super nervous before a game, or like can't focus for certain things, and like had to take like Adderall or like those drugs to kind of make you focus in. Like, how do you work with those types of athletes?
Well, that's exactly why it's so important to look at all performance on an individual level, because again, you might have one player or one athlete that had those issues that needs to be addressed individually, because that guy or girl cannot necessarily have the same protocol as the rest of the team. So that's where everything actually goes wrong, in my opinion. It's about, we're just putting a top model down and we're expecting everybody to just deliver from that. But we need to focus on the individual athlete from the inside out. So in that specific example that you're giving with an ADHD, for instance, or any other like anxiety, you need to create some kind of, again, preventive protocol that the individual can kind of make sure that when it's required with a high performance need or whatever game they're going to, then that everything that's going on in between the games or in between the trainings on a daily basis is what you actually prevent and what you put in store for that. So you're capable on the exact day. Let's say it could be hard to memorize things for that kind of athlete. Then you again have to kind of help them with building a structure where it makes sense and where it resonates with, instead of creating a lot of stress about it, because obviously a lot of people would have a lot of stress because there's so much expectation on these things. So you have to kind of build that structure that is fit for that individual. So it's not, nothing is impossible. It's just also about using things as a advantage rather as a limitation. Because let's say you do have a high dopamine. Dopamine is the main driver for motivation, focus, and action. So whatever we want to pursue, we're depending on the dopamine. And dopamine we could also talk a lot about, but we need that for the actual performance, to be in our best game, to maintain that high level of motivation. But for some people, let's say they do have a week and they have these addictions. We all have addictions. So it's not about pointing fingers at anybody. It could be, like I said, the phone, news, scrolling, social media, likes and stuff like that. But it could also be sugar, it could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be anything. So we all have some kind of addiction. But those who have a high level of dopamine, they might always tend to want more. So how do you talk to your brain? How do you communicate that with your brain? You might be needing to have a protocol of, let's say, daily meditation, which could be an important intervention because that actually lowers the nervous system down. And by doing that, you're doing the opposite of what dopamine is required. And you cannot have like calm and flight. You cannot have both. So you want to force that dopamine receptors to have a lower production. So by doing that consistently, let's say, just even though you don't necessarily have the need for it, but preventive, that means that when you go on that pitch that day, that when you go into the field, then you get more sensitive to the amount of dopamine you will release, because you will release when you're completely dialed in, you're focused on everything. Then you get so much more sensitive. Then that means the neurochemical all of a sudden works much more efficiency. So that would be a way to look at these things. So I never look at anything as a limitation for anybody. I just always look at, so how can we use that so-called limitation as your specific tool, as your advantage?
Are there any differences in dopamine from, I guess, like location to location? Because I feel like dopamine may be higher in the US than it is probably in Denmark, or like from gender.
I'm not sure. Well, I think they say in terms of the ADHD, and I'm not an expert on any cognitive disorders. However, obviously it's a common thing today with people that develop more and more ADHD. But I would believe, and I'm not really right to have the right answer to it, but I do believe that there's so much in what you can call, like, just look at the TV in America. There's constantly something spiking your desire or your pursuit of something better that you always want. And America is built upon pursuing something. It's always goal oriented. So I would definitely say, yeah, I would imagine that there's a higher temptation as well in America. Yeah. And then again, I also see it in Danish athletes. So, but yeah, if we should generalize, I would definitely say there's so much going on. Even when you go to an NFL game, that was my first time last year. I actually went to see Cardinals, and I always watched it without the commercials. But what I realized was that, oh my God, they're just trying to get my attention constantly whenever the games is stopping. Then I can buy a lottery ticket. Then I can be part of this. And that's just a common thing. And I guess Americans is used to it. But me coming from outside and seeing those things, obviously I noticed, like, Jesus, they just want my attention constantly. And I hear that, unfortunately, as well, for those, my friends that live in America, that always say, oh, it's just like, the level of stress is just so high.
Capitalism.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all
Exactly.
that's what we like to do in America. Just hey, we need your attention all the time. And for me, like I know
Yeah.
it was like my sophomore year in college where I got tested and found out that I had ADHD. And had to figure out a protocol like before games that like kept
Yeah.
me relaxed and not so like hyper all the time. And like this is what I've
Yeah.
used now like throughout it all. And it's like there's three movies that I have to watch like before the game. Like, and this is what I
Okay.
do just to stay relaxed. Like it's the night before, like I watch, and it might just also be like rituals that you're like so superstitious about too. Like
Yeah.
night before I watch Any Given Sunday, the day of the game, like I'm watching Remember the Titans and Space Jam. Like those are my three movies that like to me like just make me feel calm and
Really?
like I don't really have to like
Yeah. Yeah.
worry
Yeah.
about anything. And then I go into the game and like now I'm tuned into the game, but also like
Yeah.
the drugs that they try to put you on, like the Adderall and the Ritalin and all that stuff. Like, what are your thoughts on that stuff with athletes? You know, because like it's easy, like you said, there are addictions, right? There are things that people get hooked on. Like, I spent time in Denmark. You know, the huge thing over there is snooze. Like everybody is hooked on that. Like I got
Yeah.
into it when
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
got there, right? And then like Adderall
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Ritalin and all these drugs that like they have athletes prescribed to. What is your thought to it, and like how much is that playing a huge role in like these mental health problems?
Massive. I mean, without a doubt. I'm actually surprised that I'm going a little bit careful here, but I'm actually surprised how much is actually going on within professional sport with drugs. I'm really surprised still. I'm also still surprised how little focus there are on the actual health part of it, of staying fit, staying well, mentally and physically. Let me just ask you a question. Can you name like four of the biggest top athletes that we all probably know, that probably also know that has performed until late age? Try to give me four names.
You got Tom Brady.
Performed until I think
For
yeah,
one
Tom
second.
Brady, LeBron James.
Kobe made it pretty decent far.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's
Uh,
usually like the great. Yeah, I mean,
the great, you
it's
know, the greatest of the great. I mean,
like the ones.
you can say Michael made it kind of far, but like towards the end of his career, like he wasn't the same.
Yeah,
We'll say
yeah,
he wasn't the
You know,
same
kind of,
Michael. Yeah.
it's
yeah.
almost like one or two, like three of a generation.
Yeah, exactly. And Ronaldo is also another good one in the soccer, of course. But the thing is about those is that it's actually not that many when you think about how many professionals that actually are in the world, really making a lot amount of money and stuff. Like I always say to the American football players I have, like it's actually something that Brady is sharing. It's not even a secret what he did, and he's not specifically gifted genetically. So what is it actually? Wouldn't it be of interest? Why? How come he stayed at that level so low? Obviously, he was doing what was right, matched to his genetic, and testing himself for sure. Also having focus on the mental side of it. Oh, and Djokovic, the tennis player, is also another one that has performed in a very late age. So I don't even know why I asked that question, but anyway, it was just interesting because we all have stuff that is with when a player has talent, you can argue with it, but the question whether that talent is going to make it or break it, that depends on how you actually build all the element and the environment around it. When I say environment in this case, it's actually how well you train, what you eat, how you address your mental balance. And like you said, when in terms of having ADHD, you had to figure out something. In my world, I'm just surprised that the team facility would not even help with that, which I would imagine they haven't. Again, addressing things individually, building the right structure, make sure whatever works for the individual, make that individual work from that, because that would be your recipe and not my recipe, and so forth. So yeah, I don't know if I forgot the question actually.
I love that though. Like even just thinking about that, because like I feel like that's why it's great that we have you on here. Because it's just like honestly, when we look at sports, we kind of think of it first like you need a head coach, you need position coaches,
Yeah,
strength coach, and then you need a physiotherapist. But like you know, these teams that have money to invest in is just like I feel like we should have people like you on our teams to really dive into that part of the sport, because just like there's more to sports, just like you said, than just being strong and performing like
yeah,
physiologically. Just like oh yeah, being a great athlete. Like for these great athletes, it's just like they invested more into
exactly.
themselves than just physical performance.
Yeah, but I totally agree. And if you ask me, like you just said, I don't know, is it something around 40 different position coaches they have on an NFL team? Not that we'd only have to talk about that, but that just shows how much there's not one single stone left unturned in terms of a physical error. And again, I guess you guys notice that as well. Every time, the day after, the same day after an NFL game, all the coaches always come out, we had too many mental errors. What do you do about it? So I'm always like, you should have at least 40 mental trainers as well to make sure that didn't happen, because it's a thing going on before the game. It's not just about the game. And just being told you shouldn't do that doesn't really have a good strategy in it. So I totally agree. If you ask me, all teams in the world, they should have at least 10 mental trainers to address all the things going on in between an actual game, because it's so much important. And just because you have an app, okay, now I'm recovered. No, it's not that simple. You've got to put the right things in before that you need to require that big performance.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like talking about like having like 10 mental coaches on the staff, like, but you're also going in and coaching the coaches now on this side of things. What are you like helping the coaches to recognize with their athletes, or helping them like work with and like individualize? Because I guarantee you, I mean, we know it as a strength and conditioning coach, it's hard at times to really get to know each one of your players that comes in, because you've got a limited time with them, and really everything you do comes down to their performance, right? So as a strength and conditioning coach, like, we're trying to get them bigger, faster, stronger, but we forget sometimes about like the mental side of things. And I know Jay does a really good job of it, and I also do a pretty decent job of it, like asking your athletes like actually how they're doing and like what they're going through in that day. Because then, like, if you have that open dialogue, they're able to come and speak to you, and like then you'll know how their lift is going to go. But like, what are you doing to help these coaches like recognize and realize like an athlete is struggling, or like where they're at like mentally too?
Well, there's a lot of aspects to it. First of all, if you as a coach on the sideline during a game, you notice that, why is he not seems like he's really here today? You know, he might seem a little bit distant. He's not really being present. And what happened? What's the consequences of that? They lose focus. And then he might yell on the sideline, have more focus. And to me, that's just such a cliche that doesn't work for anybody. Because if you don't know on an individual level, what the hell does focus even mean? And I try to teach them, but okay, focus is individual, but it has to resonate me before I actually know what direction that GPS is telling me to go. So it might be a very individual thing that they can teach them. So the individual, like always, I always have like individual mantras that people have to work on. So let's say there was a player, he needed to have hands on the ball. He might need to say that during the whole game. And that might seem super, super exhausting. But for him, his subconscious mind, by saying that to himself, he knew exactly what his focus needed to be. And by then, eliminating any noise, because we have noise going on an internal level, which could be, shit, I hope I perform well. I hope my coach see how good I performed today. Or shit, they're not throwing the ball at me and stuff like that. We have so much noise going on, and that happens for everybody, even at the highest level. Everybody has that internal. You can probably relate or even have memories of that as well. So just by creating that individual, what is your focus point? What do you need to tell yourself to know, when I say this to myself? I even had some of the Danish players, they said something out loud in Danish in the last season, and they just laughed about it because nobody knew what they were saying anyway. But so for the coach to actually address something, they had to kind of help the athlete build whatever works for them. It could also be talk about motivation, for instance, because motivation is the key to get focused. If you're not motivated before you show up, this is just going to be something, a cloud in passing by. So you have to start from the foundation. So what actually motivates you? And I would even suggest coaches by understanding what motivates myself. What am I driven by? Am I driven by something external, which is very rare the older we get? Is usually an internal driver, which could be more on the emotional level. And again, we're back to addressing the emotions. So the fact is actually that we have emotions all the time. They control our behavior. So even the fact that we don't like to address it, it's like insane. It would be saying, I know I have an arm here, but I'm not going to talk about it. Well, it is what we're built of. The emotions needs to be there for you to actually perform. If you don't have aggression, temper, rage, or whatever, or even feeling the opposite, if you don't have that, you're just like a robot. You cannot even perform at your best. So we need to either put them in play or don't put something else in play. So I think for the coaches to establish what actually motivates me, for one thing. Motivation is so important to address. And it's not just about giving a pep talk and then just say, let's go do this. No, you got to go a little bit deeper than that. You have to understand for yourself as a coach, what actually motivates me? Okay, that's interesting to know that structure to get that information. So how do I actually look at my athlete that I'm trying to get the best potential out of? How do I address that? What do I look for signs? And then I will be able to address those. So that could also be, finding the focus, for instance, because again, that just becomes a cliche unless you do know what it is. But also to understand what goes on a neurochemical level. Even if you don't have the actual data from it, understand what's going on. The common thing I could give an example of, if a team is behind, what happens on a body language? What happens on a neurochemical level? Well, obviously, they drop in the positive dopamine in this sense, because they don't believe in themselves. They have already kind of created that failure, so they don't believe in the success anymore. So just by understanding that, how do you then as a coach spike the right thing again? And it could be that they had something going on before the game, between the trainings and stuff, where, they create something that they could, as a group, be focused on. And just by him addressing that subconsciously, we will be able to ignite that dopamine for the right purpose again. So there's a lot of things that they need to understand. Also, like setbacks. What do we do after a game, for instance? That's a very common thing that the coaches just always pushes them, maybe say, you just need to work harder, you need to train more. But very often it's not the physical training, and you guys probably definitely know that. It's not just about training double up, because what happens then is overtraining, and then you have to deal with that, and then you don't feel strong enough, and then you're going to tell yourself you're not good enough anymore. So it could be that something else needs to be built for them to be more conscious in their performance. But you need to address it vocally before you actually execute on it physically. So that would be some of the things. But I do believe that the coaches need to kind of go through it themselves before they can pass it on to the athlete. Yeah, but also goal setting, for instance, that's a funny thing as well, because they always, like, I think there was an NFL team that was saying that we're going to win the Super Bowl, and we're just so motivated by that. But the fact is, understanding that the brain don't operate like that. Yeah, it's good to have a long-term goal, but you have to understand that until the brain can taste it, like, I have something I'm pursuing, which is the dopamine. I have something that I'm chasing, but then I'm getting kicked down. How does my brain actually think that's going to be realistic? It doesn't. So we have to understand how the brain works for them to actually make the brain the biggest chess player when we're actually performing on a physical performance.
Totally.
But that's tough, you know what I mean? Like you're asking grown men, not even just men, like you're asking athletes to talk about emotions. Like that's something that, especially like in our field, like when we're talking about American football, like that's not something. And then even for men in general, talking about emotions isn't something that's in society ever been seen as like acceptable, because it makes you seem weak or soft or like too vulnerable. Like how do you break down that barrier to like allow people to know like it's okay to talk about your emotions, because at the end it will make you stronger?
But the thing is, and I do really know those things in terms of men doesn't even have the vocabulary of emotions. So are very rare. If men have, because it's mainly men that I also help in terms of athletes. So very often they have a hard time even knowing the word for that specific thing. Yeah, I feel something, And then I always twist it around saying, but what mood would that have been? It's also about addressing it the right way. What mood would, I was super mad. Okay, great. That's an emotion. It might have another word for it, but that's fine. So it's also about learning the skill of putting words to something so they can actually use it as an advantage, as a tool. Like for something, sometimes I always have with my athletes, do a simple 3 daily step. Let's say before training. It could also be before game, obviously. But I always tell them to use this practice for themselves. By themselves, they don't have to share it with anybody. Usually that should kind of teach them a little bit to start open up for that thing, something called emotions. So the first step is always, what's my goal for today? And then I had to write that down. It could be that, well, my goal is that I want to be having longer throws, or I want to be able to run faster today. So it's like a specific thing. They have to have a specific goal for that day. And secondly is how am I going to show my strength today? Whatever strengths I have. It could be that I'm starting to become very vocal on the field, or it's whatever. I want to be able to also address, this is one of my strengths. Maybe I'm a good motivator for my teammates and stuff. So whatever strength I feel like I want to show up with today, I decide that. And thirdly, the last part. So what would I want to feel today? And that's always the hard part. Like, happy, satisfied. It could be anything, but it's not important. There's nothing right or wrong in this. It's more to do with what word would I know how to put onto that. And usually what people have, what they come back with in this little exercise on a daily basis, they always come back with that it actually made me feel like I'm at least going for a specific target. So that gives me purpose and focus because I had decided one specific thing. And focus especially is something that a lot of, especially in the young generation, they have so hard actually to maintain focus over a longer time due to the society we live in and all the distractions that we have gotten used to. So we don't really master that anymore to keep that focus. So that's another benefit of that. So that could be a little exercise each individual could always be. It could even be in, I'm not an athlete in that sense. I mean, I might have my training, so it's not like I'm really goal oriented. But let's say before this call, what would be my goal today? And what strength do I want to show? And how does that want to make me feel? So just by having that little exercise, it makes us conscientious of our actions and how we want to improve that tiny percentage every single day.
Yeah, I love that. I wanted to ask you a quick question too, especially with regards to like evoking emotions from certain, especially men. I think there's one thing, and I've noticed it. I just recently noticed it with an ex-soccer player that I was training the other day. But the relationship that athletes, most important American football players, have with food and their weight, and I just kind of wanted your take on it because I think, like, for me, I don't know about Coop, but like, I think probably Coop too, but it's like our relationship with food is like, it's a task, right?
It's a what? It's a test?
A task.
Oh, a test, like, yeah.
We eat because we need to be at a certain weight. Like all coaches are just like, how much you weighing? Just like, hey, what's up? How you doing, son? How much do you weigh?
Yeah.
So like, I remember after football when girls or guys were telling me, they're looking at me, and I was like 125 kilos in college, and guys and girls would look at me after football like, dang, like you lost weight. And that used to it used to infuriate me. Like, damn, like you're not as big anymore. You're losing weight. And I was actually just training an ex-soccer player yesterday, and he was telling me, he was like, and he's a fit guy, a very fit guy, and he was just like, yeah, my friends are telling me like I'm not big, and I'm like, you're a big guy. He's like, I want to gain like 4 or 5 more kilos, and I'm like, for what?
Yeah. It's such an interesting question because in any of the sport I have, I always, if I wanted to exaggerate a little bit, I would say there's a lot of almost like an eating disorder in any sport. Either it's one thing that you have to get so massively big, or the opposite, you have to be so extremely underweight. So I also do believe there's a lot of culture within that is hard to get out of. I actually had a cyclist once that he told me that, well, I need to lose those last 5 kilos. And it's like, well, why do you have to do that? First of all, if you're biking in Denmark, we don't have that many hills here. So I would understand if you're really climbing the mountains. But secondly, the damage to your body for being underweight and then requiring such a hard performance of yourself, that has a really massive negative impact. So that's one thing. And then again, but you cannot argue with, I come from this culture and everybody talks about it. We need to lose weight. And the same goes in a lot of American sport, I have now come to realize, not only in football, but also in baseball. And it's always about, can I gain more weight? Can I gain more weight? And I know that you guys have to be big in that sport. So I can also, again, I can understand the protection part of it. However, there's also another thing, which is obviously not something that would be looked into in that type of sport. But there's something that is very important to address in this, which is if you gain a lot of weight, which is like fat gain rather than muscle gain, the consequences of inflammation is super high at the same time. So it's the question of, there's nothing wrong with wanting to gain that weight, but it's what you gain it with. So again, we're back to not the macros, because the macro is just the protein, the fat, and the carbohydrates, which is obviously the majority of what we need to focus on, but we need to understand the micronutrients in that. So it's the quality over quantity. And you can still be wanting to gain weight if that is important, if you think you're going to perform that much better, which I would imagine in American football is pretty essential. Again, but why not make it essential to also focus on the quality of it? Yeah. So that would be my response to that. That being said, when I do have American football players, I obviously know that there has to be some solid weight behind that huge punishment they get, so I can understand that. But again, I would always recommend, in my recommendation, I would always look at, but what is necessarily gonna make you gain weight? You can still gain weight on a healthier level that would also limit the ability of actually generating the likelihood of injuries, which is again something that is super important to understand, that the biochemistry is maybe lying something underneath your likelihood if you're genetically disposed as well.
That's actually interesting to bring up injuries too. I was always curious about, like, do you deal with athletes that are injured? I know that's probably a big mental gap for athletes.
But yeah, it's obviously very, very devastating to having played maybe one, like you mentioned before, Coop, that you may have had a few games and then you're out for a devastating injury or something. And even that mental process of getting over that, I know in American sport, at least, it's not the same thing in soccer, fortunately. Hopefully it will change, but in soccer, for instance, you can be almost injured for as long as it takes, you still get the same payment. So that's just the benefit of that. But you don't do that in many American sports. So there's also another fear attached within that, not making money because I'm not playing, or even am I even keeping my seat in this squad?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that, again, I think is a little bit unnecessary to create that stress environment. I had an athlete last year as well where this thing happened, and he was injured after 2 games in the season. And yeah, he was in the deepest black hole you can imagine. And we had to create some strategy for that, because obviously he hoped that he could come back, but you never know. You never know if somebody else jumps in and takes your position. So that's just another danger attached to it. So we had to kind of, like, first of all, get him up, make sure that he was physically in the best possible way, for also speed up the recovery. Because that's again a part. It doesn't help that you're just going to be lying on the sofa watching Netflix and fueling yourself with sugar and processed food, and that. It's not going to help that recovery phase for sure. So how can we at least make you feel like you're taking charge and you're taking control of that process, and then we're going to build in something else you can take benefit of? How can you maybe benefit for something else that you can be good at while you kind of forced in that situation? And I actually have had quite a lot of athletes where we had to build that because all of a sudden they were out of the season in whatever sport they were at. So we had to kind of create something else. What else can we use? Take this opportunity to, and then use it as your advantage. Can you get super smart at something? Can you get really strong on your arm or whatever? Could you do something so at least you feel like you're still in control of your process, of your goals, and wherever you're going with this?
What about we talk about injury, and then like the sport eventually ends, right? And like Jay and I are both like, Jay will say like he wants to put it in the universe, but I know for sure this is the last season for me. After this is done, like there's a huge part of us that's been wrapped up in the identity of like, you're a football player, or you're a track athlete, or you're a soccer player, whatever it may be. And you're seeing a lot of athletes now, once like the sport is gone, going in very, very dark holes. And again, we talk about athletes taking their lives afterwards. Like, what are some things that athletes can do mentally to help like be prepared for that time, when it's like the sport is over, and like finding a new identity, or like when it is done, like what can you do like mentally to like actually help yourself like not go in that black hole of like, I'm still watching other people play, like, man, I could still be out there, or dang, the sport is over, like what do I do next?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because again, I think that's such a big mistake in sport, that that whatever club or facility or whatever you are, or I was about to say a franchise that you have an agreement with, I don't understand why they don't even have that in place as well. But that's another topic. So I think that I can completely understand that loss of an identity, because again, how can I get all my skills, all my expertise into play in a work life, in a business life? That's a big question for a lot of people. Do I even have the competence to do anything else? I know I can run fast, or I can play ball, I can play tennis, or whatever it is that the individual have. So what else can I use this for? So I can completely understand that. But first of all, I would always look at what strength has brought me to this place. What strength and capabilities have I developed over this time to become whatever athlete I have become, with that success I have? It's good to always remind ourselves what we have succeeded in. So I always tell my athletes, look back, write all these things down. Where have you actually done something that you felt like that is a super big accomplishment now that I look back? So you start with actually building your new identity. Where can I use that? So first of all, you have to identify, I'm actually good. It's actually good to emphasize that yourself. What can I do with these strengths? Do I actually want to contribute that to other players? Do I still want to be in that environment because I actually like being in that environment? Or do I don't want to see anything that has to do with that specific sport anymore? I do actually have was in dialogue with two ex NFL players that both went into a deep depression for 3 years. They didn't even want to tell anybody that they have been part of that. Well, they're like, no, I haven't been there. Just ignore that, because again, there's so much building in that. And then again, establishing those things that made it feel fun for you, that made it feel motivating for you to do those things you did, and where else would you see that could benefit? And that could be a process for anybody, I would just say. So it's not that simple always, but it would be about putting the skills in play, maybe in other settings, of course. I do also have, like yourself, probably ex-players that want to still be in that, but now they have so much experience that they want to help others to see and not go through the same errors that they might also have done themselves. So that is an obvious thing, and that's what a lot of ex-athletes obviously do. But in terms of getting somewhere else, it's always a big question, because you have to reinvent yourself and believe that whatever brought you here also have another place in that. So do I need to seek out new networks? Which I would probably always suggest, do I need to have a one-on-one to somebody who can actually kick me through that place, kick me out of the door, see my new potential in this? Because there's always potential with something you bring with you. But it is it's the thing about the identity. Creating that new identity is just such a hard thing.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely speak on that, because I remember when I got cut from the NFL, and I was the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that's where I'm from too. So after I got cut after preseason, I didn't want to be around anybody. I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want anybody to know it. So at that time I was dating a girl that went to school at Florida State. So I left. I went to just go live with her because I didn't want to be in my hometown. And then I get called CFL and all that stuff. But then I come over here, and everybody always wants to post about, ex-NFL player comes to Europe. I hated it. I hated when anybody ever talked about ex-NFL player comes over here, because then the first question you get is like, bro, you were in the NFL. Why aren't you here? Why'd you get cut? What are you doing in Europe? And you're like, man, what am I doing? Why am I here? Do I belong back over there? Or am I doing the wrong thing by playing football over here? And it wasn't until 3 or 4 years ago that I actually started using that to my advantage. Former NFL players over here, all right, let me see how I can get sponsors, or how can I start working with other athletes, because I have the experience from that. That was so much ingrained in me that it took me down some dark paths where I was like, well, man, NFL is over, CFL is over, what, and then on top of that, you start applying for jobs and you haven't done anything else, right? Because all of our experience
Exactly.
and work has been done with, you're trying to get into the NFL or the CFL and be a top athlete. So you haven't been able to like really work on sales. You haven't been able to
No.
go into like working on spreadsheets or any of the stuff that like the normal everyday person is doing in life. We haven't really had those experiences. So you're hearing kind of really for, I would say probably like the first real time, you're hearing no. Like, no, like we're not accepting your application, or no, like you're not good enough for this job. Like it's hard to be in that
Super
position
hard.
that you're like, bro, what am I worth to this world? And then you got all the other stuff in life going on. Like, cause at the same time, like when I got cut from the NFL, I lost my dad. Like I lose my dad at the same time. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on in life? Like,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
there any
It's
purpose
so
to it
hard.
anymore? So
But it's actually good you bring up that word, because that's the thing that also come to my mind. It's about creating that new purpose, and in that environment you come from, people actually look up to you. You're super respected. You have a purpose with somebody, and now all of a sudden you don't even have a goal. You don't have purpose. You don't have no clue what motivates you, because you have to reinvent all that. So I would say it would be a complete self-assessment where you would look at, okay, what would actually motivate me in this time of age and my current age, which is not, I'm not trying to target any getting into the team, getting into the NFL. Now I had to reinvent it. So how can I put all my skills, all my talent in play in a different environment, in a different setup? So what would motivate me? And is it people? Is it behind the screen? Is it I need to inspire? Whatever it is, but we need to understand on ourselves what actually motivates me, and also have some long-term goal, because obviously, how do I want to look at my life from what I have created, and even changing completely direction all of a sudden in life? What do I actually want that to look like? And within that, you can also look at the person and the passion in it. Like, what am I passionate about? Well, I'm passionate about seeing other people grow in whatever they're doing. And it might not just be the same sport. It could just be in general. I'm actually really good at that. Or is it the health perspective from my strength and conditioning that I feel like I want to do it? So it's about really dialing into, what am I doing at this moment? What do I have that I can make grow for something bigger? Because there's no doubt, whatever we're passionate about can be used in any other settings. And then obviously also accept the thing that it takes time to build a new identity. It does. It also took time before you actually become the player. It's not like when you are 7 years old or 6 years old, how young you have started playing that football. It's not like, I'm a football player. No, you were probably a boy having fun with the boys. And then part of that was we played football. So you didn't consider yourself to begin with as a player. That took time because you did something over and over again. For instance, in my own situation, I used to do a long distance running before I had 2 hip operations and completely smashed my hips. But I identified myself, I'm a runner. What are you talking about? So when I had the first hip operation and said, you're not going to be running again, I'm like, wait, that's my identity. I am a runner. It's not just something I do. I am a runner. And that was so crazy because I was not even professional, and obviously it was not even my profession or anything. It was just like how I looked at myself. So I can completely understand having all your day, every single waking and sleeping hours being part of something, and then all of a sudden it's not that anymore. But I think it's also about accepting that this is actually an opportunity rather than an end road. It's like, okay, now I have this on my side that I can actually have the opportunity to build something else with.
So with society, how it's going nowadays, right? Everybody's got access to things, right? And then you look at the phone, like you talked about earlier. You've got social media, you've got TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all these different types of avenues to see things. And nowadays, if you like talk to coaches that are a little bit maybe older in the game, or coaches like myself and Jay, we would say that society has become a little soft. Would you say that is true, or is it like, or are we just more open to things, or are athletes like, how are they being more vulnerable to like what is actually going on? Because like you said, mental health is like taboo, but now you see a lot of athletes that are coming out and speaking out about like the issues that they're having, but then you still got the old school guys that are like, no, that's soft, like you shouldn't be saying that, like you shouldn't be like putting that out to the public. Like where are we going right now in society with like the mental health stuff? And like, is it still like, is society getting softer, or are we in that middle ground, like that weird spot where we're are we heading in the right direction?
Well, like I said in the beginning, that when we talked about whether American is worse, I would actually start by correcting that, because apparently Denmark is one of the countries with the highest amount of stress, people that actually have stress. So it's not like I would like to say that we're better, but apparently in Europe we're not. And if that is a comparison, I don't even know. But are we getting softer? I actually think we're just getting more and more unhealthy. So, and I also do believe that we have maybe something, I don't know how to describe that, but I also think, because you guys coming as American, my boyfriend, he's from England, and he still cannot understand how little we work in Denmark. But nevertheless, it's apparently not about the workload. And so he's like, wait, you're always off work and stuff. So I would imagine coming from America as well, like you said, we don't work that much. We have kind of protected in wages and vacation, pension and stuff like that. So why are we so stressed also? I don't have the answer for that. And are we then becoming more soft? I do believe that there's kind of like we kind of wind each other up, I would imagine, is what I think. And also we become unhealthier because it has to be convenient. It has to be easy. We have so much crap in our food today. And I do believe that part of the biggest problem in the mental side has rooted in the bad diet we have. And also, obviously, a high level or a low chronic level of cortisol. So that means that we're just constantly on a low baseline. So that means this is where the genetics comes in. So when we do have a genetic disposition for actually being more sensitive to any of these imbalances, we tend to seem like we tilt or we break down a little bit sooner. But actually, it's just because our baseline is just so bad in our Western society, even in Europe and as in America. So I think back to that as well also, I would imagine that those that come from the older generation in terms of the mental approach, like it's a taboo, we don't talk about it. If you today would address it the same way, the militaristic, just toughen up, I'm just going to break it down like David Goggins or something, I'm just going to break it down and then you're probably going to be stronger. That likelihood is probably only going to be 20 to 50% that would actually benefit from it. The rest would just break down. And that's not to do with, well, some people are strong and some people are not. Yeah, they are born either with a bigger resilience than other. So, but before that, obviously comes the physical baseline. And that's just really bad today.
Yeah, yeah. So that's hugely important to and like I said, when I first came over here, I was the same way, like your boyfriend is. Like, how are you guys stressed out? Like, I get why, I understand winter depression because I was spending winter in Denmark. I get that, right? You guys got too many dark days and never seeing the sun. And like, I understand why the Danes, when summer's here, you guys are outside. You guys ain't leaving. You guys ain't going back in the house until that sun goes down, right? You guys are outside. No. And you guys might.
It's cold. We just gotta be out.
The happiest country in the world in the summer, right? But wintertime, exactly. Nobody's talking to each other. So I get that. And then also, like, just the hustle mindset and the grind. I mean, coming from America, like you said earlier, it's like it's constant go. Like, it's constant, like, trying to get your attention, always trying to, like, reach an end goal. And, like, you get there and then you're like, all right, what's the next thing? Like, what are we doing next? Like, what's it, like, continuing to go, like, continuing to hustle, trying to get somewhere. I think that's why we see such a difference in, like, America compared to just Europe in general. Because you guys have a different pace of life. But I think that's also why some of us Americans come over here and enjoy life too, because we actually see that there is more to do with your life outside of just, like, working and trying to collect a check and trying to, own this pair of shoes or own this car. And like you never really see the world or see life or, like, enjoy it, like, enjoy what you've actually labored for. And I think you guys have been successful at that part of things. I mean, I loved being able to mix the two, like being able to mix, bringing in my American mindset, but also enjoying the Danish lifestyle. I think that was the best balance to me.
Yeah, and I actually want to back up something on that, because since now that I do also have a lot of American coaches as well that I talk to, I always laugh a little bit about, because I used to in my childhood, I was an elite gymnast, and I was naive enough to think that I was going to the Olympics, even knowing now that no Dane have ever gotten that far, because we cannot ever compete with Russia or China, because they have a level of where with like the consistency and how much they actually require of the individual. When Denmark's like, no, it's just twice a week. We're going to meet up and have a nice training. And if you want to do something in between, that's all good. And in my mind, even though it was not required, I always showed up to to our gymnast training every single day, because my mindset was apparently not very Danish. I always hated that we have this, yeah, it's okay if we lose. Is it okay if we lose? No, 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 no. We have a competition going on here. It's about winning. So in that sense of addressing, if you want to be good at something, that's why probably also why you guys have a lot more high performing athletes, or delivering the amount of athletes that you do. The what's it called? Like the frequency of what you expect of people to do in order for them to become better. Obviously, that is kind of logic, but we have a really weird mindset of that. And what I can hear from the Americans coming to Denmark, they kind of laugh at it. Yeah, people, they kind of not always show up and stuff like that. So I like to have that a little bit better, bigger level of ambition, to be honest.
Yeah, because
not to point fingers at any Danes. I don't hope
isn't
anybody.
the big thing in Denmark Law? That's
yeah.
That's another one that comes into play with, like, because I remember when I first heard that, where you're not allowed to feel like you're better than everybody or anybody, and like you're equal, and like I was like, yeah, they don't fly with American football, bro. Like this was like the common thing I would always tell like a lot of my Danish players was that, hey, if my mom were to line up across from me, like I would want to try to beat the shit out of her. You know what I mean? And that's just the type of mindset you had to have like playing American football. So I think that's a different thing with just sports and athletes compared to like Europe and stuff. But the last thing I kind of want to ask you is for athletes, coaches, or anyone trying to kind of like go like down your route too, what would be your best piece of advice, like from the mental health side of things? Like if you want to become a mental health coach, or if you want to work more with your athletes that have, just talking about the mental side, or if you're an athlete dealing with mental health issues, what would be your best piece of advice for them?
That's always the tricky question, because if there was, like in any performance, there's never just one thing. It's about stacking the positives, to be honest, because obviously there's a lot of things in terms of positive psychology, which could be meditation, breath work, cold exposure, going into nature. There's a lot of all the positive psychology, what can you call it, tools that will be recommended for anybody, obviously. So the more you look at the preventive side of it, like how can you do a proactive approach to your mental health? So even if you're dealing with some mental imbalances, or maybe you feel maybe that you kind of lose that motivation, or you kind of feel like you have that lack of focus, concentration, have a bad sleep, always start to notice the signs. For many of my athletes, it always works when they actually journal, because that also gives they kind of put their thoughts out of their head into paper. So they kind of get the ability to reflect in a different way. And what we also do know from science is that anything you write in hand from your brain to the paper, you tend to reflect on it differently than just having all the weird thoughts. And also to kind of empty the clutter going on. There's always a lot of clutter going on when we're on the edge of maybe breaking down. Again, a lot of people, they might say that, oh, I got my shit together, I don't need to address these things. But the more you have look at it like what's it called, like martial art fighter, for instance. They have to be so nailed in mentally. Do you think they have time to maybe worrying about how was my day yesterday, who am I fighting against tomorrow, and stuff like that? They need to have their brain rested, reloaded to reload. And that's the essential part, no matter where we are and no matter what state we're at, even if we're not dealing with any mental pressure, is how to build a strong mentality on a brain matter. So it's more to do with, I reload my brain to reload when I require that actual performance, which also means that meditation, for instance, is something that science has shown over again, how much it does for you to actually lowering your cortisol levels. And cortisol is the enemy in terms of the mental health, It's not something we do want to avoid always because we have it naturally going up and down, but we want to make sure we don't have a low grade of chronic stress response. And by doing interactions like meditation, like breath work, for instance, you can actually prepare yourself and make that baseline stronger, which is always what I look at. And then look at your sleep, measure it in terms of how many hours do I actually need to sleep? How do I feel when I wake up? I actually had another player that was measuring his own sleep, and he discovered by doing this spreadsheet and everything that 9.10 hours was what he was required to sleep. He felt rested, he felt mentally sharp, and he felt like he was completely recovered. And that's super individual. That also depends on age and stuff like that. But look at the basics to begin with. And I would always say, if anybody have anything where they kind of maybe be a little bit suspicious about, they're probably not in the best mental state, I would always look at my diet. Forget about the sugar, forget about the processed food, and especially forget about the alcohol. That would be my look at that, because that is the building the foundation that communicates to your brain. And people always get surprised how big of an impact this is actually is. Like, I only drink in Denmark, for instance. We have a recommendation for the government, the health system, that women can drink up to 21 units per week, and men 21.
Oh wow!
For me, it's just insane that it's even being on the list. They should not even talk about it. They should just shut up and be quiet. Let's just be clear that alcohol is not good for anybody. It does not belong for any athlete whatsoever. It's just my opinion. Can I control whether my athlete do that or not? Of course not. But if you ask me, I would say if you have a performance, that effect on the brain and the whole body has an impact for more than a week. It's not because you have a hangover. We're just talking about, it's ethanol. It's poison you put into your body. So if you think that you're going to go in and require your brain to make the quickest decisions so you won't have the mental errors, you're just so way off. You have already lost so many points in that. And because we always tend to, maybe if we have a little bit for coaches who don't think they actually need to perform, but they do. So some of the coaches that I am in dialogue with, I'm like, I actually calm down with a glass of wine, and it's all good because there's resveratrol in it, so it's good for my cardiovascular. There's a lot of antioxidant, and I always say to them, but if you want to have that effect on it, you actually have to drink up to 100 glasses of that red wine to have that benefit. You can have that in supplements without that hangover. The ethanol, the damage on the liver, on the brain, the gray matter in the brain, everything, that is just so devastating for the brain and any performance. So don't use that as a tranquilizer. There's a lot of really beneficial natural supplements that I would recommend if you need to calm down. But a free way to do it is always to focus on the breath, because the breath is actually calming down the nervous system. And by that, you would also have a decrease in the cortisol. So that could be a tool for anybody. And you could even try it out, even if you're not really sure, but just do it as a preventive tool as well.
Heard it here first, athletes. Put down the alcohol and start breathing. Sheesh. I know we talked about it on an earlier episode about how much guys are actually using
chocolate. I have to say cardinals. Pizza. One line. Danish is such a weird language. That would probably be. I don't even know. Sørg for at have en god dag. That means make sure you have a good day. Top athlete or tough? Top athlete. Hjalte is by far my biggest idol in this, because I just love the development that he's been through, and he's also adapting super quick. So I admire him a lot for everything and how he's become where he's at today. Smørbrød. Wow, that's a fun one. Probably a bear. Thank you so much for having me. I look so much forward to see whatever work you have in place going forward as well. So thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
I hope to maybe meet you in Denmark someday. Both of you. Yes, let's do that.
I'll come through when Coop gets there.
Right, I would love that. Okay, have a nice day.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you. Bye.